Hello everyone, this is Space Café Podcast and I am Marcus. So, for the word of the year that no one is asking for right now, but I was just wondering in my own little head what it could be if I were to be asked at some point. So, whatever, I suggest change. It feels like this is a year of change. Profound tidal waves are smashing ever harder against our shores, and this is just the beginning, I have the feeling. Of course, we are all worried about what will happen next. The Ukraine-Russia crisis, the energy crisis and its manifold consequences, the crypto cleanup process, artificial intelligence. I should do a separate episode on that. And the perennial companion climate change, of course, and so on, and so on. And somehow we seem to be like the rabbit in front of the snake here, motionless and unable to act. So, in this episode, we deliberately invited someone unusual to our format, someone who at first glance has nothing to do with space, but at closer look makes a lot of sense. I have the feeling that we should look more to the right and left of the beaten path if we want to find solutions, real solutions. And that's what we're here for today.
I'll put it in front of me. My phone battery is really terrible, so I hope it managed to catch the full hour, but we'll see how it goes.
My guest is a professor of sustainability management at the renowned University of St.Gallen in Switzerland, an expert place for business administration, economics, law, and international affairs. But at second glance, maybe we can learn something from this corner of the world. Let's find out. Welcome, Professor Judith Walls.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Judith Walls. I am the chair of sustainability management at the Institute for Economy and the Environment at the University of St.Gallen. I guess what I like a lot is biodiversity. I'm passionate about environmental topics. What I don't like, that's a difficult thing. Probably many small things, nothing huge.
Climate change, maybe.
I don't like climate change too much, although of course it's very relevant in my job. But,
of course.
I guess I don't like how we're living at the moment as a society. I think we're over relying on the natural resources.
Overdoing things. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Overdoing things.
Yeah.
Moderation. Right. I think that's the key.
Are you a moderate person? Can you moderate yourself?
It's not easy. I try to. I try to, but I like most people, I have a life, I have a kid, I have a husband, I commute, I sometimes travel by air. I find it difficult to be vegetarian just from a personal preference point of view. So I try as much as possible, but I'm not perfect.
Neither am I. I mean, like, we're all raised in that kind of way of life, in that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do different, but it's very hard to imagine a different lifestyle. I mean, like, I'm in my current situation now. I'm in the lucky situation to do a documentary series about the importance of nature and the environment in different places around the globe. So, how do I get there? I mean, like, of course, I have to fly to these places. At the same time, I'm trying to tell that story of those places to create awareness for the planet. So, I mean, like, should I go? Should I not go? So on the one hand, the traveling bit tells me, don't go. The storytelling bit tells me, do go. So what's right? What's wrong?
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult thing, especially when you're in a position like that, when you have the ability to use your voice as a platform, and then you get invited to places where you have to travel, or in my case, sometimes teach places where I have to travel to. And then it's a bit of a dilemma, right? Do you go? Do you not go? What is the additional value that you create by going? Do you create an unknown ripple effect even? If you change one or two people's minds about a topic like climate change, is that sufficient justification for air travel, for example? So it's not so easy. I think this is a thing that I personally struggle with, and many people in my bubble, shall I say, many people who care about sustainability struggle with these issues. Yes.
We're right in the middle of it already, but let's back up a little. You're at the University of St.Gallen. This is not your regular university. Can you tell us a little bit about why it is so important?
Well, the University of St.Gallen, I think, is particularly well known in Europe, especially amongst the business community. We're a business school. That is the university. So we don't, not like all other universities where they also do other things like sciences and engineering or medicine. We don't do that. We only do business. And it's very well known. It has a strong reputation. It also, amongst the students, I'm told, has a reputation for being a bit elitist in some ways. But I have not personally found that with my students. I think my students are very engaged, very aware people who understand sustainability and what it means for business, and are very much interested in solving that issue for business. I would say what we excel at in particular is teaching executive education programs. So we also have a lot of contact with practice. And so our motto is from insight to impact, right? So the insight comes from the scholarly work that we do, and the impact comes from engaging with students in practice. And I really feel that this university is a living embodiment of that motto.
How does regular business, including all its research that goes with it, get together with sustainability and impact thinking? It's not your natural combination, I should say.
Yeah, I think traditionally this has always been viewed, sustainability has always been viewed as an issue outside of business. So when I first started my PhD, I'm now talking about, almost 20 years ago, in 2003, I wanted to pursue this topic. I wanted to talk about sustainability and what it meant for the very top of the organization of corporate governance questions. So now we're talking about CEOs and boards of directors and shareholders. And I was often asked, why do I look at this? What is the connection? What is the relevance of corporate governance to sustainability? I was always told corporate governance is a finance issue. It's about returns to shareholders, about protecting shareholders' rights. But somehow intuitively I had this feeling, no, this is really critical, because if we are wanting businesses to monitor and do something about their sustainability impact, it has to be at the top level of the organization, and it has to involve these parties, right? The top managers, the board of directors, the shareholders, as well as other stakeholders. And over the last 20 years, I've really seen a huge shift in that also amongst my own colleagues from a scholarly perspective, as well as in practice, that people now cannot talk about corporate governance without also talking about sustainability, or so-called ESG. That's the terminology that financiers and board directors like to use. So environmental, social, and governance issues. And it's all bundled together. So I think it's actually quite critical these days. And in my view, business cannot be successful without also addressing the sustainability issue. We are at a point in time where we literally have about 7.5 years left before we will cross the planetary boundary on climate change to such a degree that it will have a major impact on our world. So this means that it's not a lot of time. If you think about how businesses are run, that it takes time to develop new strategy. It takes time to implement those strategies. And if you're talking about innovation or technology. In some industries, this can take 10 to 15 years.
Absolutely.
We are really running out of time. So we have to do it now. And that's, my mission when especially in the teaching and the engagement with practice that I do, to communicate that urgency.
So 7.5 years, that's frighteningly crazy. 7.5 years till doom. I mean, like, is this when we will reach a point of no return? Is that what it is?
Of course, we don't truly know 100%. Science is very careful to say that we can never fully know, the future, that we can't fully predict the future. But from what we do know and the predictions that we make, we know that we will most likely surpass the 1.5 degree temperature rise that is set up in the Paris Agreement, possibly even 2 degrees. And depending on how swiftly we take action or not, it could be much, much worse than that. I don't want to say it's a doom, or doomsday scenario. I just think that we will pass a tipping point, which means no possibility of return, but return to what, or what is the new state, So the new state is just going to be something different. It doesn't necessarily mean everything is lost or everything is gone, but it just means that life as we know it will be quite different.
Will be different.
And we will have to deal with that. We will have to adapt.
How do you personally deal with the situation that you, as a researcher, as a scientist, you don't bullshit. You know what is going on to the best of your abilities. And at the moment, we see that everything that science has told us, has predicted, is happening. Like right now, all over Europe, especially also here in Austria, our lakes are drying out. Our rivers are lacking water. There's no rain this year. So this is nothing new to science. And this is happening as we speak. So how, as a scientist, as a researcher, can you not run around like crazy, shouting at people and do crazy things? Because, I mean, like, how can you content yourself in all of this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And you're right. Why am I not running around shouting at people? I think it's because when you do that, you don't get heard.
Sure.
And we have activists, we have the Greta Thunbergs of the world. We have the Extinction Revolution. That's their role in society. They are there to wake us up, to let us know this is happening and we need to act, and we need to act now. But quite often they are limited in their provision of solutions, and they also can alienate, a lot of people because they have a dialogue at a different level. There's different ways of having dialogue. My goal as an educator is to meet people where they're at and then push them further, whatever step or steps that they're ready to take. And this is getting easier. It was much more difficult in the beginning because I would get questions like climate change is not real or it's a hoax. What are you talking about? Scientists don't agree. And then I have to explain, actually, scientists do agree. The counter arguments that you read are not science. They are something else. Now the message is more one about urgency, as I said, just to make people aware that, climate change is happening, especially here in Europe. As you said, we know climate change is happening. We can see it. We can actually observe it with our own eyes. But then people still think we have until 2050 to sort the problem out. And I said, no, we don't have until 2050. We literally have to do this by 2030. And now it's year 22 and a half, and every time I give this number, I have to add a few months because it's a few months later that I teach another course and more time has passed. So this number is rapidly going down. The 8 years that I mentioned last year has become 7.5, which will soon be 7 years.
Crazy.
I feel that this is starting to be heard, right? I do feel that even company executives, suddenly when I mention this and when I present them with the detail as to how this works and why I say this, they feel it and they suddenly feel the urgency, and then suddenly there's panic. And that's also not my goal, right? I'm not here to create panic. I'm here to focus on how can we solve this without creating fear without creating a sense of hopelessness, or a sense of it's too late and we can give up. Because if we move people there, then we can't really expect much to happen, right? So we have to alert people without alarming them, and then, help them to seek solutions and enable them or empower them to do whatever they can to address this.
Do you think that something is different now as compared to like 5 years ago when it comes to awareness? Because I have the feeling that nothing is really changing, that we are comfortably numb in our little cocoon of Western lifestyle. So is something going on in your professional observation?
I think the awareness is rising. At least that's what I see. People are more aware, and when I then talk to them, they become even more hyper attentive to the issue. The difficulty has always been and will always be behavior change. It's very difficult, as we said at the beginning, to change behavior. We all have our habits. We're used to doing things in certain ways. We have cognitive boundaries in terms of how far we can predict the future or will comprehend what the consequences of our actions are. And so it is difficult. It's like, I always compare it to making your New Year's resolution and saying, I'm going to be fit this year. I made my New Year's resolution. I'm going to be fit. I'm going to do the gym 3 times a week. And then real life kicks in. And then guess what? I'm not doing the gym 3 times a week. So this is the difficulty. I think it's possible. I mean, I have a little bit of hope from COVID. I mean, it sounds weird because COVID was such a huge crisis and affected so many lives in such a negative way. But what I found hopeful about it is that we did see that people could change their behaviors, that we could feel like a responsibility, for example, in Europe, in Switzerland, to wear masks in public or in public transport or in universities, in the classrooms. Change our habits. Instead of handshakes, it became fist bumps.
It was unthinkable. I mean, especially in Switzerland, wearing masks is an unthinkable thing in the first place.
Yeah, I lived in Asia for a large portion of my life, and people there, when you have a cold, you wear a mask. It was normal. And the first news that I got about the pandemic, I remember I was in Zurich airport, flying somewhere, of all things. And I went to the pharmacy and bought a mask, and I put it on. And I think I was one of about 3 people at the airport who was wearing a mask. And I got such funny looks, because of what is this person doing wearing a mask? So, but that's changed, now you can be the only person in the room wearing a mask and nobody will blink. So I think, that has given me some hope that when there is a real need and we can make people understand why it is that we need to do things in a different way, that to some degree people will accept it. But there was also a lot of pushback. There were protests on the streets in Switzerland, in the Netherlands, Germany. I mean, different places, Austria probably too. So I do think it's a tricky issue, when you have so many people involved who need to all change, then you're going to have a division of opinion.
We need a movement. There was a very popular book a couple of decades ago. It's still avidly being read by smokers. So if you want to stop smoking, there's this book. I can't recall the title. If you read through that book, at the end of the book, you're a non-smoker. So we would need something like this for our way of life. Somebody come up with a book that changes our minds.
That would be a good thing. I mean, I don't know the book. Maybe when you remember it later, you can send it to me. But, I do think we need general insights that are interesting that people can read and gives them options, right? Strategies for how to do this. What can we do instead, right? And not just what can't we do. I think that's too limiting.
Exactly. And don't tell people they can't do something. It's all about maybe wanting to stop something. And yeah, I think that's the mindset. By the way, I looked it up. It's called Finally Non-Smoker. Maybe that's the translation by Alan Carr. Alan Carr, Carr. That's the guy.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. I was wondering, because you were specializing, of course, by your profession in sustainability issues in the business world. So I'm wondering, is sustainability and impact thinking in the business world, is that more than a luxury? Excuse my ignorance here, but I mean, like, it could also be a nice marketing tool for a company to use it. And hey, I'm green, I'm impactful, I'm full of sustainability. But why would a company do it? Because they gain nothing from it in a economically competitive environment. So it only costs. So why would that be an option?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that it's not just a cost for companies. And, the things you mentioned, there's several aspects to it. Number one is this question of marketing or what we call greenwashing in the industry, right? Claiming that you do something good for the environment or even for society, but then doing something different than what you say or not doing anything at all. And greenwashing, I think, used to be more common. Years or decades ago, the companies would be quick to make a claim and say, we're green, we do this thing. We have a label, on our product and it's good. The problem is that consumers and other stakeholders, including investors or governments or whoever are getting smarter, right? And they're starting to read into it a little bit and looking these things up. And you have all these watchdog organizations like Greenpeace or WWF, perhaps, who are quick to point out when a green product isn't really green or when a company is doing something that isn't really green. And then the company has a problem, right? Because now they've marketed their product that way. They've found out that they're not doing that. And it's a question of reputation costs, right? Or legitimacy. And reputation or legitimacy is built on trust. And if you break trust, that's very, very difficult to build back. So we all know the example, probably, I think it was Nestle and the milk powder problems that they had. I believe it was in Africa, or Coca-Cola and the water issue in India. There were many of these examples of companies not living up to their promises or doing something that just wasn't right, that cost them a lot in terms of reputation. I mean, let's talk about British Petroleum, BP. They were the green darling of all the investors until the Deepwater Horizon spill happened, right? Yeah. So you have an event like that and it just kills your reputation. So that is a cost. That's a direct cost for companies, not an imaginary cost. That costs them money, right? Consumers stop buying or the prices go up as a result. We also can make a business case for sustainability in other ways. Companies actually, when they waste in their production process, when there is some kind of pollution or some output that is undesired, they're actually not being efficient, right? So they're wasting resources. So by changing the way they operate, they can avoid waste and use their resources more efficiently. And that is actually another way of saving costs. So this is kind of more the business case for sustainability. I think that's traditionally how companies have motivated why they do sustainability over the last 20 years or so. What I see now is a shift beyond that, maybe more purpose-driven or I don't know what to call it. It's beyond that. It's sort of more transformative, sustainability action. So they're doing it because simply it's the right thing to do, and they don't want to be on the wrong side of history in the future, and they want to anticipate the changes that will happen with climate change. So they want to mitigate, for example, climate change as much as possible. They also want to already start to adapt to the changes that climate change will bring to them. So it's a two-way street, right? And on the one hand, companies affect climate change. On the other hand, climate change affects companies, so they have to have a dual strategy. They're trying to build resilience as a third strategy to cope with whatever unexpected things may fall across their path. And these are things that help companies in the end. We saw that in COVID very clearly, that the resilient companies, the adaptive companies, those that were more aware of supply chain risks, global supply chains, things like that, were actually better off in the end, right? And so COVID we could not anticipate. We didn't know that was coming. I mean, maybe some medical professionals could anticipate at some point this would happen, but we didn't know, with climate change and biodiversity loss, we know this is going to happen. So I would say the companies that are going to be smart about this and place themselves at a competitive advantage for the future would be taking action now. And that's what I see happening.
Do you see a ditch in that environment currently through the Ukraine-Russia crisis, the energy crisis? Because I could imagine that the first thing I would ditch now in my company is any kind of sustainability action, because now it's all about surviving this crisis.
Yes and no. I mean, I guess it depends a lot on the type of company, the industry they're in, how big or small the company is. So I could imagine for a very small business, that is feeling the pressure from the energy crisis, from the war, from perhaps other effects, like recession that are coming off the back of this, consumers spending less money. Then, the belts are being tightened all around, and they may need to rethink, a little bit what they do. Perhaps sustainability is one of these affordable luxuries that they can forego, as you would have said. I don't see that in big business. The big businesses that are serious about sustainability, that are focused on it, they understand the difference between a short-term crisis and a long-term, perspective, long-term horizon. And so they very much aware that it's not possible to forget about sustainability because, like I said, we have about 7 years left, 7.5 years left. So if they don't act now, they will pay for it in the future. So that investment is being made again. Of course, business still has to be business, right? So they still need to make money, or enough money to be able to invest in those things. So that is all part of it. And then a lot comes into play. If you're a publicly listed company, then the investment community comes into play. Whether or not investors support these kinds of strategies, have they got patience, right, to see the rewards from those kinds of strategies? Insurance companies are very much also part and parcel of this whole, financial and support type of industry for businesses, because they are the ones that pay the price, right?
Sure.
If assets are flooding or forest fire burns down your factory, then the insurance costs go through the roof. So these are the types of industries that are critical in creating that shift. And that's where a lot of the focus and attention is now going as well.
So who has the most knowledge about what to expect in the next couple of years? Because you mentioned the insurance companies. I guess they could be the ones we should look towards, maybe not up to.
Insurance companies obviously are very concerned about whether they can pay out, the claims that are being made. My understanding, I'm not an expert in insurance, but I had people visiting my classes and talking about this, from the insurance industry. My understanding is that we've reached a point where insurance companies literally are paying out more than they can invest. So it's costing them money right now to insure businesses already. Maybe it's a temporary thing, but this is obviously not a good business model for an insurance company. And that means they either have to raise their premiums or they have to stop insuring certain things. And certainly we are seeing movement away, both in insurance companies and in the investment industry, that there are assets that nobody wants to touch, in some circumstances. Certain investors don't want to invest in fossil fuels, and certain insurance companies don't want to invest certain types of assets, So then that's a tricky question. If you're running a business and you can't attract capital and you can't insure your own assets, where does that leave you, right? You take all of your risk on your own shoulders, and that's very dangerous.
You know what?
I would say.
You know what the incredible thing is? The mind experiment. Picture yourself. You're going to another planet. You see another population of humans 2.0. They're in the same predicament, and you are asked as a visitor for your advice what to do. I mean, like, everyone would know what to do. We would say, stop what you're doing right now. We know what to do, but we just don't do it. So Judith, what makes a resilient company, in your opinion? Where is the edge, the bifurcation for companies that make it into the future and that don't make it into the future?
Well, I would say the first thing is to be forward-looking, right? And don't stop your imaginary future 2 years from now. Don't think too much about the short term. Don't think too much about how am I going to make money this quarter or next, in the next year, unless you're really in financial distress. I mean, I think that's a different situation. But the average company that's doing fairly well, think about what this all means going forward. We have many examples of industries that were dying out, and some players in those industries were forward-looking enough and aware enough that this was happening, rather than putting the blinkers on or the blinders on and saying, no, I'm going to stick my head in the sand. This industry will survive. And then, those companies did not survive because they were not anticipating the changes that were coming. I think anticipate, and inform yourself what climate change really means, what biodiversity loss really means, what it means for your business or your industry. Think a little bit about the consequences and the ripple effects that might happen, and then strategize around that, and there might be differences in what you do now versus 2 years from now or 5 years from now. But the companies that I think will be most resilient are the ones that do that sort of forward thinking. And we talk about backcasting in my field, right? So backcasting means imagine where you want your company to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and then work backwards the steps that you need to take in order to be there. There's a great example, Interface. It's a carpeting company. The now passed away CEO, Ray Anderson, had that vision. He kind of had this wake up call. He read 2 books and sort of got he called it a spear through the heart, right? He realized what the problem was with sustainability and decided that his business, carpet making is a very dirty business, was contributing in a negative way to this, and said, okay, I want to have a fully, zero waste, zero emissions business by 2020, right? That was now many years ago. And then he kind of worked backwards of what are all the steps that we need to take, to achieve that. And they came very, very close by 2020 to achieving this. I think not fully exactly how their vision was, but they made so much progress. They got 80 or 90% of the way there, which I would say is already good enough. We don't have to be exactly perfect, but if we can reduce our emissions by 80%, this will allow us to avoid the most severe consequences of climate change and bend the curve in the other direction, right? So, and similar with biodiversity loss. So I think, do that. Don't blind yourself.
Is there like a manual out there? So if someone needs guidance through that, is there where would they go?
Oh boy. I mean, there are many books now that have been written about business and climate change adaptation, or business and climate mitigation and resilience. We know a lot about business and environmental strategy, generally different ways of approaching that. We know a lot about innovating for circular economy or cradle to cradle concepts, as we call it. How do you change your production process so that you don't need any new virgin materials from the ground, right? How can you kind of close the loop of production? So I think this is where most businesses now are going, towards circularity or circular economy, to really try and close that loop, which of course also reduces in many ways the amount of energy we use to extract this stuff and to produce stuff, etc. I mean, we never get completely away from energy use, but then what is left can be sourced from renewable sources, for example, and, to still produce what we need to produce. So I think this is kind of one big aspect. Again, the big question mark for me is more the consumer behavior side, right? The sort of unrealistic needs and wants that we create for ourselves, that we must have the latest version of this or
whatever
that,
kind of gadget,
some gadget or clothes, the fast fashion industry, all these kinds of things that we've been socialized by marketing companies. My husband works in marketing, so I can critique it heavily. To think that we need it, to think that we want it, to become used to having lots of stuff, right? Exactly. And when we don't really need so much.
Okay. So we need to sort of slowly gravitate a little upward, because this is the Space Café podcast and this is all about space. So in case our audiences are wanting to know where all this goes, I promise we're now moving upward. And we have an intermediary stage, and that's aviation. And you wrote a book about sustainability in aviation, in the aviation business. And that's, of course, super interesting, because the aviation business is highly criticized for being not compliant with our planetary needs. So can aviation ever be sustainable? From your research.
Yes, again, I don't know the answer to that, but I can say that, or I can confirm your statement. Yes, aviation emits a lot of greenhouse gases. And we know that, we need fossil fuels to get planes off the ground, keep them in the air and land them again. I guess it's similar for rockets. I was looking up earlier today how much, CO2 is emitted for a rocket into space, and it's a lot more than a flight, than an airplane. Oh yes, like per person, if you look at space tourism, it's between 50 to 100 times more
per
CO2
rocket
emission per person in the rocket. So.
But now we have bazillions of airplanes and maybe a handful of rockets still. So it's a good ratio still.
The ratio is still good, but I'm thinking about the
regular
space tourism plans, plans of some billionaires that are out there, and I worry. But flying is not clean. There are things that can be done, right? There are things that can be done. There's a lot of movement right now in different, like alternative fuels, so-called sustainable aviation fuels. I'd rather use the term something like synthetic aviation fuels. I'm not sure if they're truly sustainable. It's still a fuel. But there are different ways of making fuels and mixing it, with traditional fossil fuels that can be used in airplanes, so that we don't need to really do much to change the engine technology, so we can still use the same types of engines, just make small modifications to get the planes into the air. Of course, there's a lot happening in innovation, right? Seeing if we can get planes into the sky using solar power, of a lot of work being done in hydrogen. I don't know if hydrogen is the solution. It's still very CO2 intensive to make liquid hydrogen and to transport it. So unless we have some additional innovation there, I'm not sure that's really the answer. I think for players in the aviation industry, so for airlines, there are also options. We can consider alternative modes of travel for shorter haul flights. So alliances between airlines and train companies, for example, high-speed train, to move people on shorter distances. We've seen that already, for example, in Germany with Lufthansa and Deutsche Bahn is a good example. You can, the ticketing system, it's one ticketing system. You don't have to buy additional tickets to go from plane to train or vice versa. And they've just extended this to the entire alliance. So it's the Star Alliance group, for example. So if you travel one of the other members, like Singapore Air, to Germany, then you can use that same ticketing system to take a train. There probably will be some uncomfortable truths, uncomfortable things that need to be done if we really need to tackle the amount of flying that's happening. There's statistics out there, like 1% of frequent flyers cause 50% of all the emissions from flying. So what can we do? To encourage these frequent flyers to do something different? What are the reasons they're flying? Is it for business, for pleasure? Is it a mix of the two? Again, COVID has given us a little bit of a boost here in terms of alternative options, at least for business. You and I are talking online, so this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. I don't necessarily have to be in the studio to do this kind of interview. So this is for some businesses like consulting industry or finance industry where people fly a lot, has been a way to save costs and be sustainable, right? So it's costly to fly people around the world. Route planning, avoiding that planes hang around airports and circle around, right? Waiting for a landing slot. Planning the most direct route rather than multiple stopovers because takeoff and landing use more energy. This kind of thing. So there are many, many options.
You know what? It's still kind of strange and funny almost that we're still in a state that we're celebrating the frequent flyers. The frequent flyers are celebrated people by the frequent flyer programs. So you have the senators, you have the Han circle with lounges and champagne and whatnot. So I'm not saying it's their fault, but the strange thing is our mindset towards celebrating that, because this is clearly the wrong thing to do. So we are celebrating overly extensive airplane traveling still.
We're incentivizing, right? Yeah. It's classic economics. What you incentivize, you probably get more of. And I lived in Singapore until recently, so travel from Singapore to anywhere is typically long distance. And because of work travel, I also am a gold member, right, in one of these airlines, which has many incentives, many benefits. You get faster through the check-in lane, you get faster through the immigration and security lane, and you get to sit in your lounge and, it's usually quite comfortable. And I think you're absolutely right. If they took that away from me, those miles will soon run out because I'm now no longer flying nearly as much. If you take that away and incentivize something else instead. So I had a student who was asking me, why aren't they incentivizing people who choose to fly on planes that use sustainable aviation fuels, right? We know which planes are being fueled with sustainable aviation fuels, and you could have a bonus, program for that.
So this is not prototype.
In some places, this is already available. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, not really en masse yet, but it's happening. That could be done. Then we're still not tackling the underlying problems so much. People are still flying, right? Which is the real issue or the real question. But that's such a difficult issue. If I talk about flying to my students, whether they be executives or young, bachelor's or master's students, the reaction is the same. I don't want to give up my right to travel, to explore, to learn about other cultures. It's good for collaboration. It's good to avoid, wars, to increase understanding, to flow business. It's good for trust building. Many, many reasons why people fly, right? So it is an important question. I would like to see places like Europe get more on the ball about high-speed rail. Why does it take me 13 hours to get to Amsterdam from Zurich on the train? That's crazy. Why does it take me 7 hours to get to Vienna from Zurich?
Yeah, exactly.
These countries are not that far apart. We can invest in this, but that takes some coordinated effort and political will to get that done.
And prioritizing.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Many things, or maybe most of those things you just mentioned, they if someone really wanted change, they could be brought about in very short time. COVID was proof, or is living proof of what is possible if there is collective political will. And so maybe, I guess, if you're talking about those alternative fuels, if maybe Europe wanted to be the prime place for alternative fuels on the continent, why wouldn't we do so? Maybe it's naive what I'm saying here, but we should push for something as Europe, to have some vision to be, or as a key place on this planet. We're doing too many things, but not really, and then sometimes, but we need maybe those strong moonshots on a larger scale.
Yes, I agree. And perhaps this will happen, as this issue becomes more critical and as climate change becomes more critical. I imagine there would be more and more attention to these types of solutions and more push, to make them happen. As always, there are obstacles in the way. I mean, politicians are in a sort of 4-year cycle typically. They need popular votes to remain or come into office. So these are some of the dynamics. We live in a very complex world, and that's a real world. We are democracies. We're not, benevolent dictatorships or any of these sort of situations where one person can push through an agenda. And probably most of us would not want to live in that kind of country, at least not coming from Europe. So there are realities that we need to overcome, but I think collective action is needed, and that's also the goal of the Paris Agreement and increasingly the goal of EU directives and initiatives. And, probably some regulation will come into place that levels the competitive playing field for all companies and all players in the industry. And then, it becomes more viable, because if it's more costly, say, for example, to do something in a more sustainable way, then the leading company typically could pay the price for that, right? And others could benefit from lower costs in other ways for a longer period of time. But if you bring some stringent regulation that is, say, European-wide, into play, then that could make a difference.
Are we lacking public pressure?
Probably.
Yeah.
I mean, in Switzerland, there was this, the Swiss people is sort of representative or direct democracy. Swiss people vote on everything in referendums. And last year there was an initiative for some kind of CO2 tax, which also included the question of taxing aviation, and it did not go through. It was a small margin, but the majority said, no, we don't want that. So that is disappointing to me, at least. Do
you have an idea why that was?
Well, I'm not Swiss and I don't vote here, but one of my Swiss colleagues told me that most likely it's because of multiple initiatives that needed to be voted on at the same time, and they somehow, interfered with one another. I don't know, I would say perhaps we still need more awareness. We still need more understanding, of the cost and the greenhouse gas cost of flying. This is huge, really, really huge. If you measure your own annual footprint of greenhouse gas emissions, and you fly anywhere once, then, the majority of your footprint will come from flying. So understanding that and that can create individual change, but can also create incentives for people to pressure for change, because I too am someone whose families live all across the world. I sometimes have to teach abroad. Ideally, I would not want to stop doing those initiatives, completely. I want to be able to see my family. I would take the train nowadays as much as possible, but if it's too far away, then I would have to step on a flight, and so to me, that's just, we need systems change, right? We need to transform the entire system, the entire way of working, because behavioral change of individuals is so difficult.
I feel like the system we live in is still an industrial type of world, and we're in a post-industrial world. We're still stuck somewhere in the 20th century in our minds and in the way we do businesses. And yes. So if it feels like that our cultural evolution is taking different lanes. So there's a slower one, and there is the fast lane and whatnot. So, and this is creating tension. So the question is, we evolve at such a rapid pace technologically, and at the same time, our minds are still very local, and our ways of doing things are still very much also political, and policy-making structures are still stuck somewhere in the 20th century. And maybe that creates that kind of unease where we do not really know where to go and how to maneuver.
Yeah. I would agree with you. And I don't think academics necessarily have the answers. There's a bit of a movement now in this kind of post-capitalist societies. What does that look like? What needs to happen? And then, the counter argument is, well, but we have this legacy, this luggage that we're carrying with us that we can't just get rid of, right? We can't just abandon all the systems that are in place. We have to, that's our starting point. That's where we are now. And we have to transform from there. And that's pretty difficult. I agree with you. And maybe that is exactly what's causing so much tension these days, and the division of, on top, all the topics, right? Whether it's vaccines or gay rights or sustainability. I mean, you see so much polarization happening because you can always find people who support your point of view, especially on social media, right? And so there is that sense of culture wars and cultural revolution or transformation that may be needed. And how do you do that? That's a sociological issue. Yeah.
Because maybe also because we lost in many places our authorities. So religions do not play that role anymore in decision-making for the individuals, especially in the Western world. Political ideologies are not as critical as they used to be for my grandparents, for example. Mm-hmm. So there were ideologies in place. You don't have large families anymore. So you're thrown back onto yourself as an individual. So there's nowhere someone to be seen that would tell you what to do in life. And for most of history, such people were around. And now I have the feeling that we are left to ourselves individually, and we cannot deal with that. And this is why we keep running to spiritual circles, and we keep running to people who deny COVID is around, and the climate people. What do you think?
Yes, I think you're actually absolutely right. And I was just looking something up. Back in 1932, Burley and Means wrote a book called The Modern Corporation and Private Property. And in this book, they talked exactly about this. They talked about how the shift in their time, so we're now talking 1932, right? So about a century ago, the shift of power, in terms of how we organize ourselves socially speaking, went from church to state, right? So had politics. And they predicted that the upcoming shift was from state to corporations, so that corporations would supersede the power of national states, which in fact they do, right? If you look at the large multinational or transnational corporations, they are more powerful than nations. They decide what we eat, how we sleep, what we wear, where we go. They influence our minds through marketing techniques. We can't do anything without corporations. And so what's interesting about that is that corporations are not individuals. And so with the church, we typically had individuals who were in charge, right? The Pope or whoever. With states, at least in the past, when there were still monarchies, we had a king or a queen or something like that in charge. Mm-hmm. And now we have the corporation. But if we know a few CEO names, but
the faceless corporation.
The faceless corporation, who have no personal liability or responsibility in most cases, even though they have personal rights, especially in the US, right? So this is causing a lot of problems. But they don't have a personal responsibility to anybody. So we are seeing a rise now in so-called activist CEOs. So these are CEOs that are taking a moral stance on issues in both directions, whether you'd like, say, Republican or Democrat in the US, right? In both directions. But it's been shown that the more democratic, the more liberal values are the ones that resonate the best with all people, regarding of whether they are Democrat or Republican. And I wrote a very interesting article with a scholar who's no longer alive, Harry Triantis, also about what could be the role of universal values for corporations. So we have 4 values that every society in the world holds dear. They have to do with health, well-being, longevity, and the preservation of the natural environment. And so this last one I find very interesting, that if this is indeed a value that all of us hold dear, we all want nature.
So there's maybe no one around who would say they hate the forest or they hate a mountain. So that's a universal good.
It's a universal thing. I mean, there might still be the odd individual who hates the forest, but generally speaking, on average, for every nation, people in that nation value nature.
It's common ground.
And want to preserve nature. Everybody likes to see, a nice lake or mountains or whatever, or be on the beach that's clean. And so if we have that as a human universal value, can we leverage that as a starting point for what we all hold dear, right? And I think that was a little bit the idea with the Sustainable Development Goals, to be honest with you, that there are certain things that we can all agree we want, right? That for society and nature. And so we should make that happen. Yeah. But I think you're absolutely right. This is part of the difficulty that on the one hand, in Europe, especially, perhaps most people appreciate that religion doesn't control what we do anymore. On the other hand, where is our moral compass?
Exactly.
And where does it come from?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Would you say we have the chance to start anew in space? We have a second chance to do things right? And if so, what can we learn from your research as a sustainability expert and researcher?
I would hope so. I mean, I would say for any new initiatives that we start now, regardless of industry, but I guess space is a good example of this. Also ocean exploration, right? For anything new that we do, let's not repeat the mistakes that we've made. We know that waste and trash is bad, right? We know that this causes problems. Already we are seeing, satellites and debris up in our, outer
orbit
space and more orbit that are floating around, probably going to cause problems if we continue along that route. Why not learn from this? And sometimes I feel like science fiction and movies have the answer for us already. I don't know if you've seen WALL-E.
Of course.
I like WALL-E a lot because it really, it's like a characterization of what humans have done to Earth, trashed it to a point where no one can live there anymore. And they've, put this floating thing in space where everybody now lives and never moves around. And then there's all this trash around them anyway. And it's the story of how do you rebuild Earth, right? And, there are other examples from science fiction like Ken Stanley Robinson, who wrote Red Mars many years ago, and more recently, books like New York 2140. But, Red Mars was something I read as a child, and it's still with me, about how we wanted to occupy Mars to create a second planet to provide us with the resources that we need, etc. And they sent a bunch of scientists, and then at some point the corporations come in and take over, and everything goes wrong. And even as a young teenager, I sort of already understood, okay, this may not be the way that we would want to go about things. If we cannot hold corporations accountable for what they do, and if we don't hold them accountable for what they do, then we're lost, I would say. So I think holding business accountable, holding corporations accountable, fully accountable for all the impact they have, positive and negative, that is the way to go forward, also in space.
So that is, to use a concrete example, Elon Musk, some of us may think that he's an important person to the evolution of progress and technology and whatnot. But at the same time, he should be accountable for what he does. And that's what is lacking at the moment, because it feels like he can do everything, because there is no frameworks and whatnot, because policy making, decision making is too slow. So he can do, for example, with his constellations, do whatever he wants. Or just very recently, a piece of a rocket body fell back to Earth, and luckily didn't hurt anyone. But still, stuff like that shouldn't happen. So he should be accountable for that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah. I mean, we talk about negative externalities, right? So these are, for example, air pollution. If a company produces air pollution, other members of society are affected by that.
Sure.
We saw that very strongly in Singapore when oil plantations were burning down and we were breathing in the bad air when I lived in Singapore. So this is what we call a negative externality. And junk falling out of space, landing in someone's backyard is also a negative externality. The person who owns that property had nothing to do with Elon Musk or whoever is sending that stuff into space, but they are affected by it coming back down. And luckily it didn't hurt anyone. And I even read that this person is probably going to have tours coming through their garden of look at this interesting space junk. And in my mind, I was thinking, okay, maybe you can make a profit of that. Maybe it's interesting space junk. But if that had hit your roof, and killed your child, the story would be quite different.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we should hold the makers of that product, that rocket or that space equipment accountable.
Yeah,
absolutely. Because that is their responsibility. They sent it up into space and they need to think about the ripple effects and the consequences of what happens when they don't need it anymore. What happens? Do they leave it in space and suddenly it comes back into the Earth's atmosphere? All of that is their responsibility. And that's not, in my opinion, bound by time or physical space. So it doesn't matter if it happens where you created it or somewhere else. It doesn't matter if it happens 10 years from now, if it's, resulting from your product. So we need this kind of accountability. That's very, very tricky to do, of course, because sometimes we can't trace things back even to who they belong to.
Sure.
I don't know if we know in this case exactly who it belongs to, but, that's certainly something we should think about. Yeah.
Do you have? Are you approached by the space industry in some form for your expertise? Not yet.
No. As I said to you, I'm really not a space expert.
Yeah,
I think I know about sustainability. I understand business very well. So I don't. Yeah.
But you have a fun Twitter handle. You're calling yourself professor and at the same time a wildlife warrior. Do you have a second life in that wildlife warrior costume?
A second life and increasingly a combined life. Yes, absolutely. So, I'm passionate about wildlife and nature. I said that, I think, at the beginning. And this passion has been with me since a young age. I over the years, have often gone to remote areas to help wildlife conservation programs, to help on programs where wildlife and humans collide. So the conflict is created, to think about how nature can be protected or work together with business. So, how business can work with nature is probably the better way to go. And that theme is now becoming very important. So climate change is the big focus for most business, but we know that biodiversity loss will have much more severe consequences than climate change, for the world. And so increasingly companies are looking at their impact on nature and how they can preserve nature, conserve it, maybe rehabilitate it, regenerate it. So this is now my new areas of research is largely going into that direction.
Great.
So wildlife warrior and professor at the same time.
What's your favorite weapon as a wildlife warrior?
A sling.
Nice. Professor Judith Walls, at the end of our show, we have a question. Why don't you give us an espresso for the mind to energize our minds and inspire us? You can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick, but just think what could be an inspiration.
An inspiration. Oof.
A quick shot for the mind.
A quick shot for the mind. I guess, imagine what you could do if you dedicated yourself to it. Imagine how much change you can create. I always try to encourage my students to become change agents, to really take an active role, in making the world a better place, because it makes us feel not helpless, the opposite. It makes us feel empowered, and it has a meaningful, positive impact. And so for me, that is the way to go, So urgency, yes, very important. Solutions, yes, very important. But we need people who can take action. We need so-called, heroes, right? So be the hero.
Nice. What kind of action, for example, for the average Joe or Jill out there in the street?
It could be, of course, personal choices you make that can be action. But I think, in my mind, business is such a dominant force in our lives that the real change has to happen in business, right? Even more than politics. Politics, yes, absolutely. We need politics to support, to set new rules and regulations. Okay. But business is there as probably the most entrepreneurial, innovative, active form of creating change that exists out there. And all we need are people who will do that and step out of their comfort zone and take the lead. And we have many examples of so-called sustainability warriors or sustainability leaders. We need more of them. Right.
And so maybe the good news maybe is that there's still money to make in that world also. So if
there's still money to make, yeah. Yeah. But mind you, most people who go into sustainability from, if they come through a program like ours, they do it not for the money. So they're willing to take a salary cut to do this. And certainly I don't do it for the money, right? I do it because I'm passionate about it. And I see that a lot. And I think that's the best way to go.
Beautiful.
And that's also how you can maintain your energy, because it's exhausting in many ways to do this kind of work, because it's never ending. Right? And sometimes somewhat depressing, but you have to draw your energy from somewhere. So if you truly are motivated intrinsically and you believe in it and you're passionate about it, that's the way to go.
Great. Music, they say, heals everything. What's your favorite tune you would connect with space? Because we're building up a Spotify library of space tunes for this podcast. So Major Tom is already taken.
Now all I can hear is 2000 Space Odyssey, right?
No, that's already taken. That's already taken.
That's taken, yeah. No,
but whatever kind of music. Go ahead.
I love like 80s and 90s hip hop and R&B. So that's what I would take with me.
Okay, give me a tune I should put on that playlist.
Oh my gosh. What to pick?
Space doesn't need to be in the title. It doesn't really. What would you take? What would you take?
What would I take? I'm blank. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
I'm not. I listen to a lot of music, but naming music is very difficult.
Okay.
I'll come back to you on that.
But please do come back to me because I will put it up on Spotify.
Okay.
Awesome.
I've got it written down.
Judith, it was a great pleasure talking with you, and time flies here. It's already...
Time flies. Thank you, Marcus. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really inspiring. An hour, 15 minutes of inspiration. Thank you so much.
And thank you for your time. It was really great to be here today.
About 7 minutes after we hung up, Judith sent me an email with 3 tracks for our Space Café Spotify playlist. But as it is in life, you have to make tough decisions every now and then. There can only be one track, right? Walk This Way by Aerosmith would have been awesome. Also, Coolio's Gangster's Paradise. But for whatever reason, I decided on Billie Eilish. All the Good Girls Go to Hell. Isn't that uplifting? All right, my friends. What else do we have? Yeah, absolutely. Put your radios on SpaceWatch.Global's Space Café radios. If you're interested in geopolitics, security, sustainability, space exploration, and everything in between, and that's the cool thing, Space Café Radio is the place to be. And by the way, if you leave me a rating or maybe even a review for the podcast on iTunes or Spotify, and by the way, if you leave me right now after this a rating or maybe even, I don't even dare asking, a review for the podcast on iTunes or Spotify, I will forever be grateful. And you will be happy because you just did something good. And I mean it. Thank you. And thank you guys. I'm looking, as always, very much forward to next time. I'm going on holiday. I mean, stay tuned, everyone. Bye-bye.